Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to join you today, uh, albeit at the moment from across the English Channel, where I'm doing research in Britain. Um, so my comments will probably last about uh, 20 minutes, maybe 25, and then I see that we have some time to discuss this afterwards. Um, uh, so ever since the cultural turn in the humanities and the social sciences began during the 1970s, the way in which we categorize social groups has been a major object of critical analysis as a social and even political phenomenon itself. Uh, this has been particularly the case where scholars, administrators, and politicians have attempted to impose categories developed in the West onto non-Western societies, where such terms do not easily fit. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Hindutva, often referred to as Hindu nationalism in the West, and as Hinduness by its originators, where the terms race, nation, Hindu, and Hinduism all defy easy definition and have undergone constant revision over time. My presentation today does not so much bring new information to the discussion as much as reflect on the complexities of the question as to whether the Hindutva movement, which itself embodies a wide variety of views, considers Hindus to constitute a race. After considering the complexity of the terms involved, I shall go on to assess the extent to which the early Hindutva proponents regarded Hindus as a race, and then consider the extent to which race applies to the meaning of Hindu in the official positions of Hindu nationalist groups today, particularly the RSS or Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the uh, major driving force uh, through most of the 20th century and into the early 20th century behind the politicization of Hindu national identity. In doing so, I intend to demonstrate that the answer to whether Hindu nationalists consider Hindus to constitute a race is as complicated and as uncertain as the terms involved. The terms Hindu and Hinduism provide excellent examples of the problems arising from this application of Western categories to societies outside the West. Both terms demonstrate the complexity of Indian society's interaction with the outside world. While of relatively recent vintage, the term Hinduism is arguably indigenous, since its first recorded use was in 1816 by the Indian intellectual and diplomat Ram Mohan Roy. But Roy coined the term in response to the British presence in India in a conscious attempt to argue that the practices and beliefs of Hindus should be understood as forming a religious tradition comparable and equal in stature to Christianity and Islam. Many British intellectuals and administrators at the time found the term useful, a fact which has led Robert Frickenberg, Richard King, and Sharada Sugur Taraja, among others, to argue that the concept of Hinduism as a religion is a, quote, invented tradition, unquote, arising from the 19th century colonial encounter. Yet even the far older term Hindu is exogenous, coined by Persians and Greeks in the first millennium BCE to describe the people living in the Indus Valley and further east. The practices of these people may have appeared similar to one another in the eyes of Persians and Greeks, but the ancient scriptures of India are very conscious of internal social divisions, as is evident in their often debated references to Varna commonly called caste in the West. This apparent focus on differences within Indian society led scholars from the 19th century onward to consider whether the caste hierarchy might constitute a racial hierarchy in Hindu thought. However, this has not been the direction that Hindutva thinkers have gone, since their project has generally been to create a sense of unity among Hindus broadly defined. What early Hindu nationalists did incorporate into their worldview was European scholarship on race, particularly that arising from linguistic science. After all, it was a British judge in Calcutta, William Jones, who first began to formulate the theory of an Indo-European language family, and the idea that its originators must have migrated from somewhere on the Eurasian steppe. Western scholars borrowed the term Aryan from ancient Indian texts to describe the speakers of these languages and connected them with fair-skinned, chariot-riding warriors who subdued lesser races as they conquered much of the ancient world. In a twist on contemporary Western scholarship, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, founder of the monotheistic proselytizing Hindu reform group Arya Samaj, argued that far from being descended from a common Proto-Indo-European tongue, Sanskrit was, quote, the mother of all languages, unquote, and that the Aryans came out of India to shape the ancient societies of the rest of the world. This line of historical thinking, still contrary to modern scholarship, continues to be a feature of Hindu nationalist interpretations of India's past. Most important in this worldview, however, is the recognition of Hindus as originally an ethnic group, rather than simply a group of believers. This, despite the Arya Samaj's focus on the primary scriptural authority of the Vedas and of its willingness to proselytize, both features that would indicate a more religious than racial identity. Similar references to the origins of Hindus as a people appear in the writings of other prominent Hindu nationalists from the turn of the 20th century, such as the Marathi journalist Bal Gangadhar Tilak and the Arya Samajist Har Bilas Sarda. The latter, in his book, The Hindu Superiority, published in 1906, argued that Hindus were responsible for most of the world's civilizations, which had subsequently drifted away from the pure message of the Vedas. Of course, there is a certain irony in Hindu nationalists asserting the superiority of Hindu practice thought, while framing this assertion so clearly on the basis of what to them was recent Western scholarship. And their use of the term race reveals ambiguities present in Western usage of that period. For instance, Sarda states that in ancient times, quote, whole races emigrated from India, unquote. These are the supposed descendants of the Sanskrit-speaking civilization that produced most subsequent civilizations. It is unclear whether Sarda means race in a biological or a cultural ethnic sense. But then British administrators of the day were at least as vague in their use of the term race, referring often in their documents to the categories Hindu and Mohammedan as distinct races. Such expressions of Hindu pride were precursors to the more formal Hindutva movement, which arose in the 1920s. Much of this newer, more clearly defined movement arose in the context of the turmoil following the First World War. Indians generally had expected to acquire more rights and more control over their own society in the wake of the sacrifices their soldiers had made on behalf of the British Empire during the war. Instead, they got restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly, and the infamous Amritsar massacre when peaceful demonstrators violated the new laws. The Indian National Congress turned its attention to nonviolent protest against British rule in response to these events. But turmoil beyond the Indian subcontinent had profound effects on the development of Hindu nationalism at home. In an attempt to preserve the central role of the Ottoman Sultan as Caliph of Islam, and in an effort to prevent the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire and the westernization of Turkey, Indian Muslims launched the Khilafat movement, which coordinated its civil resistance with the Indian National Congress. Mohandas Gandhi's willingness to cooperate with Muslim activists focused on restoring a pan-national, pan-Islamic caliphate led many Orthodox Hindus to leave the Congress, including members of the Akhil Bharat Hindu Mahasabha, or All India Great Assembly, formed in 1915. This organization, which is still around today, although less influential than it was earlier on, played a significant part in inflaming tensions with Muslim communities through its efforts to convert Muslims to Hinduism. This tension played no small role in persuading members of the Muslim League that only a separate homeland for Muslims, what became known as Pakistan, would ensure their safety after the British left. The Hindu Mahasabha's willingness to convert Muslims to Hinduism might at first glance appear to indicate that it defined Hinduism ideologically rather than biologically. However, the rationale behind these conversions was in fact based on biological descent. Indian Muslims were descendants of Hindus who had, in the Mahasabha view, been either lured away from their traditional beliefs and practices or forced to convert to Islam. Mahasabha proselytizers saw their activities as reconversion of wayward Indians to the proper Hindu dharma of the ethnic group to which these Indians belonged. The Hindu Mahasabha had no ambitions to convert Muslims beyond the Indian subcontinent. This perspective was represented most clearly at the time by a man who would one day lead the Hindu Mahasabha, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Like Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, Savarkar studied law in London. Unlike these two founders of independent India, he advocated violent resistance. His willingness to publish his views and provide physical assistance to those who acted on these views landed him in jail and later under house arrest in the early 1920s. It was during this period that he coined the term Hindutva in his major political work, Essentials of Hindutva, published in 1923. Savarkar was no Orthodox Hindu. Indeed, Siegfried Wolff has described his beliefs as, quote, strategic agnosticism, unquote. Savarkar criticized caste and regarded religious belief as relatively unimportant to understanding Hindu identity. Rather, he referred repeatedly to Hindus collectively as our race, which he argues goes back to the ancient Aryans. He described the Hindu nation as an organism. Yet this race was not strictly biological, since it was the result of a, quote, commingling of races, unquote, Aryans in the north and Dravidians in the south. Rather, the Hindu nation, or Rashtra, as it was called in Hindi, was based on a common culture with a shared ethnic background. To quote Savarkar, these are the essentials of Hindutva: a common nation, Rashtra, a common race, Jati, and a common civilization, Sanskriti, unquote. This Sanskrit civilization included all the religious traditions that came out of it: Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh. By expanding the meaning of Hindutva, which he defined as Hinduness in English, to include other religions of Indian origin, Savarkar broadened the base of support for his movement while highlighting the contrast between them on the one hand, that is the indigenous Indian religions, and Islam and Christianity on the other hand. Although Savarkar recognized that, quote, all those who love the land that stretches from the Indus to the seas as their fatherland consequently claim to inherit the blood of the race that has evolved by incorporation and adaptation from the ancient Indus, can be said to possess two of the most essential requisites of Hindutva. So he's saying that all these everybody who is has Indian ancestry can be said to possess two of the most essential requisites of Hindutva. Nevertheless, he emphasizes that it was only two of the prerequisites, because, quote, a moment's consideration would show that these two qualifications of one nation and one race, of a common fatherland and therefore of a common blood, cannot exhaust all the requisites of Hindutva, unquote. Regarding Muslims and Christians, he goes on, quote, it is clear that their original Hindu blood is thus almost unaffected by an alien adulteration. Yet they cannot be called Hindus in the sense in which that term is actually understood. Because we Hindus are bound together, not only by the tie of the love we bear to a common fatherland and by the common blood that courses through our veins, but also by the tie of the common homage we pay to our great civilization, our Hindu culture, which could not be better rendered than by the word Sanskriti, suggestive as it is of that language, Sanskrit, which has been the chosen means of expression and preservation of that culture, of all that was best and worth preserving in the history of our race. We are one because we are a nation, a race, and own a common Sanskriti civilization, unquote. For Savarkar, Hinduness was not just a common biological background. It was also participation in a common culture. The race did not even have to be biologically pure, as contemporary Nazi ideology was insisting at the time. Savarkar recognized that Sanskriti culture arose from an ancient commingling of races. Savarkar's ideas heavily influenced those of a contemporary Hindu nationalist, Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, who in 1925 founded the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Volunteer Society, abbreviated RSS. The RSS was a paramilitary organization that supported the creation of a Hindu Rashtra along the lines envisaged by Savarkar. Significantly, however, it avoided direct confrontation against British authorities, focusing instead on efforts to create a disciplined body of Hindu adherents in anticipation of the day that British rule inevitably came to an end. It is from Hedgewar's success that Mahadeva Sadashivarao Golwalkar that we have the most assertive and controversial vision of the Hindu Rashtra. More religious than either Savarkar or Hedgewar, Golwalkar nevertheless embraced much of the racial rhetoric of the 1930s. In We, or Our Nationhood Defined, published in 1939, he expressed admiration for the Nazis. Quote, to keep the purity of her nation has been manifested in her culture. Germany shocked the world by her purging of the country of the Semitic race, the Jews. National pride at its highest has been manifested here. Germany has also shown how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to the root to be assimilated into one united whole. A good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by, unquote. If the implication for Muslims and Christians was not clear enough, he made it clear elsewhere in the book. Quote, the non-Hindu peoples in Hindustan must either adopt the Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must entertain no idea but those of glorification of the Hindu race and culture. In one word, they must cease to be foreigners, or may stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights, unquote. This harsh treatment for those not fitting into the Hindu Rashtra, nevertheless, was not the same as what was occurring in Germany, where Nazis regarded Jews as a wholly irredeemable biological race, ultimately destined for annihilation. Amid its utter intolerance, Golwarker's rhetoric reveals a different concept of race from his contemporaries running the Third Reich. In his assessment of interwar Hindu nationalist worldviews, Christoph Jaffrelot argues that, quote, the traditional xenology, unquote, of Hinduism fit uneasily with the eliminationist eugenics of Nazism. Quote, all in all, the hierarchical principle of the caste system makes the eugenic criterion of elimination difficult to apply. The other is not excluded, but he can be only integrated at a subordinate rank. The members of minorities who refuse to be Hinduized are bound to remain statutory second-rate citizens from the nationalist point of view, unquote. Golwarker published We, or Our Nationhood Defined, shortly before succeeding in 1940 to the position of Sarsanchalak, or organization leader of the RSS. The burdens of leadership forced him to make practical adjustments to his ideological positions during the Second World War. These positions, however, remain true to the central goal of creating a Hindu nation. He, along with Savarkar, the RSS, and the Hindu Mahasabha, all refused to support Congress's resistance to British rule during the war, arguing that defeating the Axis took higher priority. This was a remarkable about-face for Golwarker, given his recent sympathy for Nazis. However, it made practical sense if the main enemy was not the British, but the Muslim Indians and an Indian National Congress that supported the adoption of a secular constitution. The Hindutva movement's cooperation with British authorities allowed it to operate more openly during the war and present itself as a viable alternative to Congress as the voice of Hindu India. Other ideological shifts reflected similar practical concerns, but also made sense in terms of Hindutva ideology. Having congratulated the Nazis on their persecution of Jews before the war, Golwarker came to admire Zionism after Germany's defeat because, similar to Hindutva, the Jewish movement recognized the connection between biological descent and ancient culture. Consequently, the RSS supported the creation of the State of Israel. But this arrangement would only last as long as Britain's occupation of India did. When Nathuram Godse, a man with connections to both the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, assassinated Gandhi, the new Congress-dominated government temporarily banned both organizations, and they lost much of their earlier popularity. If the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi discredited the Hindutva movement when India became independent, the excesses of Indira Gandhi 30 years later during the emergency restored its credibility. Fatigue over the Congress Party's corruption and restrictive economic policies enabled the Hindutva movement to gain political power and ultimately dominance in the form of the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, which was originally formed out of the RSS. Many members of India's current governing party are also members of the RSS, among them Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But the RSS has evolved, presenting, at least in its official pronouncements, a less harsh vision of India's future than Golwarker did in the 1930s. Jaffrelot concluded in 1995 that interwar Hindutva racial ideology was, quote, nothing but a form of upper caste racism, unquote. This was a plausible characterization of the interwar Hindutva movement because its leadership at the time was entirely upper class. Most of its top leadership were, in fact, Marathi Brahmins. It is a more difficult argument to make of the Hindutva movement today, when its leader, Narendra Modi, is of lower caste birth. Moreover, the RSS has distanced itself from some of Galwarkar's rhetoric, particularly related to fascism. In 2006, following Congress's victory in elections 2 years earlier, the RSS disowned "we" or "our nationhood" defined as, quote, neither representing the views of the Guruji, that was the organization's honorific title for Galwarkar, nor of the RSS. Rather, RSS spokesperson N.G. Vaidya claimed that the more central text for RSS beliefs, quote, is Galwarkar's bunch of thoughts, since it consists of his views after he became Sarsanchalak on June 21st, 1940. But Bunch of Thoughts, a compendium of Galwarkar's speeches and essays published in 1966, still identified India's three greatest, quote, internal enemies, unquote, as Muslims, Christians, and communists. And it explained why Galwarkar still regarded Indian Muslims and Christians as incapable of inclusion in Indian society. Quote, when we say this is the Hindu nation, there are some who immediately come up with the question, what about the Muslims and the Christians dwelling in this land? Are they not also born and bred here? How could they become aliens just because they have changed their faith? But the crucial point is whether they remember that they are the children of this soil. What is the use of merely our remembering? That feeling, that memory should be cherished by them, unquote. However, as this passage indicates, while Galwarkar did not think biological race was the sole determining factor in his exclusion of Indian Muslims and Christians from the Indian nation, this was only because he acknowledged that they were descended from Hindus. It did not mean that he would have accepted, for instance, African or European converts to Hinduism as truly Indian. The importance of adherence to indigenous Indian religions is an additional, rather than an alternative, qualification to Indian biological heritage that one must meet in order to be considered Hindu and therefore eligible for full membership in Indian society. The modern RSS generally adheres to this line of thought, while it avoids the use of the term race, and even occasionally talks inclusively about Muslims and Christians. It assumes that all members of the Hindu nation must be descended from the ancient inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent. And with this insistence, it also insists that the Indus Valley was the original homeland of Sanskrit, from which all the Indo-European languages descended. The RSS, therefore, avoids having to deal with the implications of ancient migrations for the supposedly ethnic purity of the Hindu nation. On its current frequently asked questions page, the RSS website declares, quote, the RSS believes that Christians and Muslims in Bharat being India, have not come from some alien lands. They are all children of Mother Bharat. At some point of time in the history of our land, their ancestors might have changed their religion and ways of worship, but that does not separate them from the Hindu society in the larger context, unquote. So that sounds more tolerant. However, the site also makes clear that in order to become members of the Hindu and therefore Indian nation, they must recognize the Hindu way of life. And way of, I say that in quotes, way of life. That is the phrase, that this phrase is a possible translation of Hindu Dharma, often used to describe Hinduism in Hindu literature, is intentional. And it allows the RSS to paint itself as a movement of tolerance in contrast to Islam and Christianity. To quote the organization's website again, the RSS also believes, respects, and follows the principle of unity and diversity as a quintessence of the Hindu worldview. For example, an average Hindu believes that the truth is one and can be expressed, told, described, and attained and realized in different ways, all leading to the one supreme reality. Anyone who subscribes to this worldview, accepts and respects Bharat's history, and nurtures the country through their social values and makes sacrifices to protect these value systems, these are Hindus in the eyes of RSS, notwithstanding their religious moorings and affiliations, unquote. No matter the tolerant sound of this statement, it is, of course, for Orthodox Muslims and Christians, deeply problematic. For them, this insistence on doctrinal relativism as a prerequisite for social and political tolerance will come over itself as a form of intolerance. But it does emphasize the assumption in the Hindutva worldview that ideology and culture are what should consign Hindu, Muslims, and Christians to second-class citizenship. However, this anger over Muslim and Christian beliefs occurs within a wider racial context, that these descendants of Indians should behave like Indians, not like Arabians or Europeans. And to behave like an Indian is to accept India's indigenous practices and beliefs. So, in spite of distancing itself from the racial rhetoric of the interwar period, the RSS, and by implication many affiliated Hindu nationalists, continue to believe that Hindus are a biological race. The problem with Indian Muslims and Christians is that they refuse to participate in that racial consciousness. Thank you.